Good time of day, fellow human person. My name's Kristian, and my brain is about to make words at you. A few weeks ago, I made a video called Why I Want to Run TTRPGs, but not D&D. And it did well. So I thought I'd make another video about D&D with a wizard thumbnail and a clickbait title to trick people into watching it. Ha! I got you, you sucker! Please don't leave. If you haven't seen that video, then just to warn you, I am going to reference it a lot, because this is essentially a direct follow-up to clarify a few points, re-add a few points that I had to cut for time, and respond to a few things that came up in the comments. Speaking of the comments, thank you so much for the response to that video. It was wild. If I didn't respond to you, it's only because I wasn't expecting this channel to require that much of my attention this early, and I have a normal life and job and stuff. But thank you to everyone who watched, liked, subscribed, and commented. I hope I can live up to the high bar that video appears to have set. Okay, let's get a few things out of the way. I appreciate that some people have strong feelings about which edition of D&D is the best, but I don't. I'm currently running 5e because it's the new one, it's the most available. It's fine. And when I was a sapling, I likely played whatever version was popular in the 90s, and I'm sure that was fine as well. I sincerely doubt there is a version of D&D that will change my mind about the game entirely, but it's possible. I'm just not invested in that. And importantly, before we get too deep into it, if you want to accuse me of not knowing anything about D&D, you're probably right. I've been running 5th edition for the last 4 or 5 years, only because it exists. And I don't really know the lore or the worlds, or I haven't read most of the books. The book I've read the most is probably the Tal'Dorei book, mostly because I'm running a game in that setting, and it's the only book I've actually bought for myself, so I kind of wanted to see what they made of it. It's a pretty good book. That's true though, I didn't buy any of these books, they're all gifts. Is that unusual? I've always been a learn by doing kind of person, never been somebody who can sit down and study. When I joined my first Critical Role inspired game, I played a human monk because that's what a BuzzFeed quiz told me I should play. I'm not even joking, I had no idea what I was doing. But yeah, in no way am I pretending to be an expert in D&D or even role-playing games in general. This is not an advice or review channel. I'm just an enthusiast, GM, player, and perhaps more significantly, someone with an interest in storytelling outside of RPGs. Tabletop gaming didn't get me interested in writing, writing got me interested in tabletop gaming. Even since school I used to write a lot. And when we started playing games, I inevitably fell into the GM's chair for that reason alone. Even when playing Warhammer, my first gaming love, I used to write campaigns and scenarios for us to play through. Those didn't work because the game's not designed for that, but you know, I tried. Adding even more to my backstory, before the pandemic I worked at a board game cafe, and as part of that job I ran RPG nights once a week, plus special events like Dread with a giant Jenga tower on Halloween. At one point I was running 3 different D&D games as part of that job, and 2 home games as well as whatever the hell else I was doing. In retrospect I probably should have made a connected world or run the same game 5 times, but nope, I run 5 separate unique worlds, separate unique homebrew worlds, all with different everything. The only thing I recycled was NPC names, and that was actually even dumber because they didn't relate. Completely different NPCs with the same name. That was very bad planning. Am I an idiot? Let's not dwell on that question, let's talk about... A lot of people agreed with me that D&D is better suited to a less scripted story, but there's still some D&D defenders from the D&D could be whatever you want it to be camp, and to be frank, those conversations kind of feel like they go like this. Ugh. What? Oh, I'm just not a big fan of bread. Then why are you eating a sandwich? Well, I like ham. Okay, but you don't have to eat a sandwich. It's okay, I'll just add more ham. I'm not sure that's getting to the root. Do you want ham? I've got ham. Are you trying to tell me how to enjoy my food? No, I'm just saying. No, you know what else would help? This sandwich is amazing. Is it still a sandwich? Stop telling me how to enjoy my food. Do you want some of my ham? No, that doesn't interest me. I don't think I'm going to be able to make that point any better than that. Sorry, but the negative comments are slightly easier to talk about than the positive ones. But thank you for the positive ones, for those of you who are lovely and say nice things. I don't hate D&D comment section. I think it's overrated, but I actually thought I was being pretty balanced in that video. There's definitely a vibe in some of those more antagonistic comments that as one of those hoity-toity storytelling DMs, I just don't know how to run D&D, that I'm just railroading the players through my failed novel. And that's not what D&D is designed for. And firstly, that's the point I was making. That's what I said in the video. You can't dismiss me by agreeing with me. That's weird. I'm not sure what about me saying that I don't enjoy modules and that I like to improv implies that I railroad my players. I'm also not clear why people think that telling a story is the only way you can railroad. Arguably, the D&D style of gaming is one that's designed to be railroaded. Players expect their GM to create the world and describe it to them. Players have no control over what the world is or how it behaves. It's a reactionary game. It's also rules heavy, which inherently makes it more restrictive than other systems. I do believe that D&D is not best designed for linear storytelling. It's better as a crunchy, combat-heavy exploration game where the players have the option to pursue a story but aren't beholden to it. So some people just hate the word story, despite it not really meaning what they think it does. But on the reverse side of that, I also wasn't saying that you can't run a social interaction heavy D&D game. In fact, what I actually said was, if you want to lean into the social interaction side of D&D, you can, and you should. It's fun. It's what I do in my games. See? I was saying that social interaction is the entire genre of tabletop role-playing games. So if that's the only thing you're interested in, D&D might be a bad fit, that's all. On top of that, let me tell you a story. I said story again. Somewhere in the early 2000s, I started running a Rifts game set in the New West. Because I owned the book, but also because Sci-Fi Wild West is awesome and no one is allowed to argue. This would end up being the longest campaign I've ever run before starting D&D. The players started out in a small town that was attacked and largely destroyed by a floating alien fortress disguised as a cloud, although curiously that's not actually important to the story. With their homes and livelihoods destroyed, they went in search of employment and found it in the county's mining operation because the mines would pretty much hire anybody as security. And that's where our game proper began. But here's the thing. Even though that was my setup and I had plot prepared for the mining town, the unintentional consequence of that setup was that the players wanted to get their lives back. They had chosen their own professions and built their own imaginary lives that effectively only existed before the game began, and I hadn't anticipated them becoming attached to them when I callously destroyed them all at the beginning of the first session. So after a few games, their characters left the mining town and went to pursue this self-assigned goal. At which point they split up, and never came back together. Yet the game continued. The player characters would cross paths and occasionally travel in the same circles, but for the vast majority of that campaign, I was running 5 or 6 different stories simultaneously, cutting from player to player as they pursued their own self-assigned objective. And it was kind of great. I made a map of the county, had notes on all the important locations, made random encounter tables that included towns that could be added to the map. I tabled all my plot and we just rolled with it. One player wanted to get his farm back up and running and decided to learn necromancy because he figured that zombie farmhands didn't need paying very much. Another took offence to a particularly skilled gunslinging local sheriff and decided to make them their nemesis. One set about robbing local gangs to try and rebuild their cybernetic surgery practice. One opened a magical soup kitchen and got on the wrong side of one of the gangs when they refused to share their magic with them. And one joined a gang who were harnessing godlike magic that was slowly corrupting them and turning them into the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. There's a lot of gangs, it's the Wild West, what do you want? I'm aware that the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are an actual threat in Rifts, but it's impossible to account for the entire lore of Rifts. Give me a break. I was writing session to session with no idea what the players would do next because there was no point in writing a larger plot if only one player was potentially going to be involved in it. Only in hindsight do I see how crazy it was to run a game like that, but everyone seemed to enjoy it, and that game ran regularly for I think a couple of years. I even started writing a blog about it. The point of me telling you this, of course, is that you may be sat there thinking that I'm some railroading, story-obsessed weakling who couldn't handle the sandbox of a great D&D campaign, but I'm here to ask if after hearing that story you think that you've sandboxed half as hard as I've sandboxed. I would love to hear about it. I think there's a misconception to assume that story automatically means railroading. It doesn't. There was a lot of story in that Rifts game, and I was happy to write it to the individual player's needs. When I say I want to tell a story, I want to see what interests the players and then expound on it. I want to tell the story of the player's choices, and I'm pretty good at it. Maybe your table likes to do a load of random side quests with no point or through line to them, but I'm willing to bet that's probably not what you do. And even if the GM is just writing down the consequences of your actions, that's still a story that you have no control over. A game's story doesn't mean a singular goal with a limited path where the DM says go here and do this. That's what dungeon crawling is. As much as the average D&D player will claim they love the freedom of the game, they actually crave structure and order. Or, more accurately, they want the railroad to be there, but they want the option to jump off and on whenever they feel like it. The illusion of freedom is very much part of the D&D mindset, the idea that the DM is supposed to know every little corner of the world intimately, that everything has its place and everything makes sense, albeit a fantastical magical kind of sense. This is almost certainly a byproduct of D&D's obsession with its minutiae. Almost every moment of every day of the players' lives has to be accounted for in a game like D&D. And this works to create immersion, but it's also pointless. The players have total control of their characters' lives, but as a result they live in one of the most stringent sandboxes of all time because everything has to be accounted for by the DM. Or as Abed put it,
I am a dungeon master. I create a boundless world and I bind it by rules.
A less sandbox game isn't necessarily more railroaded, it's just abandoned the illusion. My game of choice is Fate, a much looser system than D&D. Fate has no lore, no setting, it barely has mechanics. In Session 0, the players collectively create the world the game is going to take place in, and then the characters are created by writing their backstories. You literally cannot make a character without writing them a backstory. And the players are encouraged to create NPCs, lore, even rules for the game ahead. The game is then intended to be run like a movie or TV show with just the important bits, the GM jumping from scene to scene when they feel appropriate and cutting out any time or travel required in between. That might sound horrifying to a sandbox D&D player, but it doesn't actually have to be that much different. Players are still making all the decisions, what happens and where they go is still on them, but the difference is that the options aren't limited to the ones that the DM has already made. In D&D, if you need to find a magic shop, you ask the DM if there's a magic shop, and they tell you that there's a magic shop, and then you go to the magic shop. In Fate, the players might decide they need to go to a magic shop, but because the world isn't carved in stone, maybe it doesn't exist yet, so the GM has to create one that suits the player's needs on the fly. Or maybe the group decides it's just a minor encounter and they handwave it so it happens off camera, as it were. Or one or more of the players takes advantage of the game's mechanics to invent a magic store themselves that's crucial to their backstory, and now they have a magic store that's significant to them and is going to play an important part in the story going forward. The end result is still that the group goes to a magic shop, but the D&D players didn't really have any options, they just did what they were told. The sandbox may allow the D&D players to deviate from the rails more than the Fate players can, but the Fate players are actively building the railroad so that it goes in the direction that they want it to. The flip side of this, of course, is that as a result, D&D-like systems do a much better job of presenting the players with a puzzle that they can feel like they solved, metaphorically, and sometimes literally. When you're creating a world on the fly, one of two things can happen in the players' minds. Either the fact that you clearly haven't thought of this detail before tells them that it's probably not important, or it signals to them that their decisions don't really matter because you're adapting to them in the moment. I understand that that could feel hollow, though not to break the illusion, a lot of DMs are doing this anyway. Players don't want to feel like they're wasting their time, so the DM will fudge things to allow them to succeed where perhaps they otherwise wouldn't have. And players are happy about this, even if they'd rather pretend to be unaware of it. It's not fun to spend your game trying to figure out the one solution that the DM wrote down. Players want to be able to talk the guards into revolting against the Mad King, or take advantage of the chaos to rob the city, rather than just go and fight him like perhaps the DM had prepared for. Every time you do something unexpected, which let's be frank is the fun part of being a player, the DM has to write the story to suit your needs. Can I use my item interaction to throw my beer mug? Are you trying to hit him? No, I just want to cause a little bit of chaos. I want to throw my beer mug up in the air and kick off my seat and land on the table and just slide across the table. Yeah, I'll allow it. Yeah, you can have advantage on the attack as the beer kind of flies through the air and he's taken by surprise. Cool, yeah, so I throw the beer mug up in his sort of vague direction. I kick off my seat, swing my legs up onto the table and slide across the table to try and kick him in the chest as I slide across. 15. Oh, that's not going to hit, I'm afraid. Okay, so as he dodges out the way, I'll slide to the end of the table and I will land on the leg that I was just trying to kick him in the chest with as he steps back, and I will roundhouse spin and roundhouse kick him with the other leg. That's a 12. Sorry. Your turn. I hit him. Natural 20. 17. Hit him in the side of the head with your mace and he goes down. He is out. The children come running up like, oh, thank you so much. No, it was nothing really. People like to say that you can do anything in D&D, but you can't. You can do anything as long as it obeys the internal logic of the game, and the rules say you can do it, and also your character has the ability, and finally, if it comes down to it, the dice rolls allow you to do it. A Dungeon Master can and should reward creative thinking, but creative thinking isn't required of the game, and that's actually a strength. Sure, you can do anything in a game of D&D, but you're probably going to do something from that long list of options that you were giving at the start of the game, and as the game goes on, you're going to work to make that list longer and more powerful. Some people will favour finding creative uses for that list, but some people will just want to make that list as efficient as possible, and both are valid. A less stringent system like D&D might require the players to be creative without the safety net of that handy list. For example, in combat, a D&D player has a list of strictly worded actions that they can do, and finding a creative use for one of those actions is a fun bonus that feels special. Like I say, creative thinking can be rewarded. In Fate combat, players can do literally anything that they logically could do within the confines of the scene with almost no guidelines or restrictions, and only creative thinking is rewarded. You can't just say, I hit him in Fate. I mean, you could, but you'll probably fail because that's not how the game works. You have to think outside the box. And that's a lot of pressure. I've seen players crumble when they suddenly realise that being allowed to do anything means they have to actually think of something. I came up a few times in the comments that D&D players and role players are two separate groups, and I think that's kind of true. Having the option to think creatively and being forced to think creatively are two very different things. I think this might be where the divide comes. When the players aren't constrained by the rules of D&D, they will often ask me why they can't just simply win because they say so, like saying you have an everything-proof shield in a playground game of cops and robbers. D&D has instilled in them the idea that they are trying to beat the game, that they're trying to win. They say you can't win D&D, but that's not true. You totally can win D&D. What they actually mean is that you can't complete D&D. Theoretically, D&D can go on forever, but players are definitely trying to win against whatever problem is immediately ahead of them. But as much as the players are the main characters of the story in these other games, winning isn't necessarily the logical conclusion of the story. And the idea that you would deliberately fail because it's what makes the most sense sometimes doesn't gel with the minds of D&D players. Regardless of that, the GM still has final say, and if it comes down to the player's imaginary control versus the GM's imaginary control, the players are going to lose. The GM can do literally anything, even in D&D. PCs have restrictions, but Dungeon Masters do not. The players are only alive because Dungeon Master chooses not to kill them because that's what serves the game. Ever wonder why the villain in a movie doesn't kill the hero when they have a clear chance? Same reason the DM doesn't drop 5 dragons on you at level 1, because then the story would end. This is going to be risky for me to say because I know my players are likely to watch this, but I improvise a lot. A lot. Your fellow Dungeon Master who's thinking about how much they improv? Well, double it. Then double it again. Then notice that it's only 1/10 of how much I improv. Seriously, if you're one of my players, you might not want to watch this. I don't know how much my players notice this because we mostly play online now, but in my in-person games, my players have definitely noticed that I don't refer to notes, and I don't take notes. Not that I don't take many notes, I don't take notes at all. And until they asked me about it, I didn't realise how weird that was. After a session is over, I'll write down place names and NPC names if they're new, but otherwise I'll just kind of store it upstairs, which is not as hard as it sounds because I am making most of it up as I go along. I'm kind of a linear writer, so when I'm working on a project or a script, I just start at the beginning and keep writing until it ends. I don't really plan ahead, that's just how my brain works. Many times my players have shown delight when something happens that ties in or recontextualizes something that happened earlier in the campaign, or there's a little teaser for something and they start to try and piece together what it really means. And I'd love to say, oh, that was planned, but it is not. When my players see something and then they go, oh, I bet that means this. Maybe, I don't know. I just pulled it out of my ass. I'm not planning that far ahead. Any of my players watching this right now, think of a really important thing that happened in the game and how well crafted you thought it was at the time, okay? Yeah, you got it? Whatever it is, I made that shit up on the fly. I guarantee it. Seriously, I will start murder mysteries without knowing who the murderer is or why they did it. Now, is this bad? Yeah, sort of. Not for me, like I say, it's just how my brain works. But most people won't be able to run games that way. Hence why this is not an advice channel. Curiously though, I think this might have the opposite effect that you might think it does. In a game where the Games Master has everything planned out and the players are trying to find their way, the GM has to modify or throw out their plans to benefit the players' needs. That seems more artificial to me, not less. In my games, I'm actively trying to outthink the players. Players do something and I have to determine the consequences and who that might impact, and if there's nobody in place, I can create someone for whom it does. It's a clearer players versus GM dynamic, and I never have to manipulate my world to outsmart or reward the players. If it feels like they're being clever, I reward them. If it feels like they're floundering, I can punish them. If they're passionate or interested in something, I can develop it, or if they're bored by something, I can just ignore it. If the players ask if this town is a temple, it's probably because they're trying to find one. You can either say no because you haven't planned for it, or in my case, I'll say yes, make one up on the fly, and see where this is going. It's possible I'm not special and that most GMs are already doing this, but I get the impression that they probably aren't. And I'm not sure if this style of free running a story could be taught. Like I said, it's just how my brain works. The gist of that video was that I think D&D deserves to be played as D&D. My intent isn't to discourage social play in D&D, and it wasn't to denigrate the game so much as it was to highlight that maybe if you're playing D&D, you should lean into the exploration and battle mechanics more than whether or not your character is sad about stuff. If you did lean into the mechanics and you didn't like them, well, don't make me say it again. I personally think that Critical Role gets the balance pretty well. It's not perfect, but it's pretty solid D&D whilst also allowing a lot of character work. But I understand that Critical Role might not be D&D enough for some people. There's a lot of fluff. And if, for example, watching Bo and Yasha go on a date for an hour and a half isn't your idea of fun, I understand. I mean, if it was a TV show, that scene would have been a 5-minute montage tops. And don't get me started on shopping episodes. I don't even run that much shopping in my home game because it's boring. I don't know how they get away with broadcasting that. But I think they've hit the limit for how much you can manipulate the game before you're just not playing D&D anymore. And you might not care what I have to say and you just want to run D&D the way you want to run it. That's fine, you can do that. But other designers have worked on more inventive, less problematic games, and you're not some sort of hero for refusing to learn that those exist. Anyway, that's me for another week. I hope I said something. I mean, I definitely said something, but I hope I said something that was worth saying. But then is anything worth saying? What is life's purpose? When we scream, does the void scream back? Where am I going with this? Like and subscribe, hit that bell, click on these other videos that are popping up here. We have one-shots and board games that are coming up on the channel, as well as our behind-the-scenes stuff about how we're making this precious content. Have fun, keep gaming, don't be a... I don't know. The end.